All right. I just set us to begin. Everyone could mute. I'm going to mute everybody just to make this easier. All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Eli Storch. I am the DAG chair, and it's a pleasure to have you here to talk about the Community Design Collaborative for our February 2021 meeting. Just a few things as we get going. As you come in, please mute yourself. We're going to be using the chat for questions, both early for announcements and then during the presentation. So if you have questions, if you have announcements, please get them posted there, and we will call out as many and hopefully all of them as we go through. If you have any technical issues, you can reach out to me. You can reach out to David Brownlee or Claire Adler, and we'll do our best to assist you as we go through the program today. Typically, our DAG meetings have been off the record, but given our ability to share to a wider audience through Zoom, the meeting is being recorded, and we will be posting this on our website to allow others to share and enjoy the material today, as have some of our past meetings. So you can go see a number of our past DAG meetings, including recent talks by Ashley Hahn on preservation in the public realm and Nikhil Saval on modern housing in Philadelphia. So if you go to our website, you can always check those out there. I think as we start to do our announcements, George Claflin, do you have a couple of advocacy announcements you'd like to share with the group?
Yes, I do. Thank you, Eli. Sorry for the phone in the background. I can't turn it off, but it'll end soon. Two things are the council's new zoning code commission and the progress on the Grays Ferry Schuylkill charrette. A few weeks ago, council approved a resolution as opposed to an ordinance to form another commission to look at the zoning code. This would be solely at the pleasure of council, appointed by the president of council. And we have some concerns about this in that the president of council has long advocated more parking rather than less parking. However, we have areas of potential agreement. We think that there should be an architect planner on this commission, and we share council's concern for the somewhat loose conception of the zoning board of adjustments job, in that they grant a very, very high percentage of the exceptions, even when they are wildly variant from the zoning. So we do intend to communicate with them about that, but that's the status. I don't think
it's framing labor.
The commission has formed itself yet. Sorry, that was a comment there?
No, I think that was just someone going on mute. Keep going.
Oh, okay. The second part is the Grays Ferry and Schuylkill studio and charrette. The studio has concluded with a very nice report that this was, Nando was the faculty member at Penn in charge of the studio, and there were students from all over the world in the studio. And the report for the students is finished, which focuses on the neighborhood to a great extent. There were 4 charrette teams, or 5, I think, that focused variably on the neighborhood and the waterfront that goes behind Grays Ferry. And now, according to our agreement with Penn Praxis, Julie and Penn Praxis are pulling these things together for the DAG report. The Waterfront Task Force has also been invited to participate, and among the people participating are Allison Harvey and Aaron Bell, both of whom participated in the charrette, and Sam Little and Peter Piven, who both attended a meeting a couple of weeks ago. So that's the status of the Grays Ferry project. And the other principal person there is James Templeton.
All right, thank you, George. If anyone has any announcements, events coming up, please put them in the chat right now, and we will get to you. But I wanted to pass it over to Marcia Moss to introduce our next presentation for our March meeting. Marcia, you're muted, Marcia. Oh, she hunts that down. I will look and see. No events, no announcements coming up.
I'm here.
Oh, there you are. Hey, Marcia.
Okay. Since 2018, Emily Smith, who's the executive director of Philadelphia's Magic Garden, had been advocating to save Isaiah Zagar's public mosaic mural at the Painted Bride. And in January, the Atrium Design Group submitted a proposal to the Philadelphia Zoning Board to build a 7-story apartment building that will preserve the mural facade in its entirety. DAG has invited Emily Smith to speak on the history and the significance of the mural, and also architect developer Shimi Zakin will present Atrium's design solution. So please join us on March 11th at 10 a.m. See you then. Eli?
Thank you, Marcia. That's going to be an interesting one, and
Yes.
It certainly has a lot of ongoing conversation surrounding it. Donna, do you want to hop off mute and discuss the Citizens Planning Institute?
Yeah, thanks, Eli. We are open for applications starting today on the Citizens Planning Institute website. We are doing the online course for the second time. We started that last fall, and I think that's about all I have to say. The course and class descriptions are on the website as well. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, so check that link in the chat if you're interested and share that around. Before we get into our program, I just wanted to say a last little announcement on the DAG side. We wanted to thank Claire Adler for all of her hard work as the DAG fellow. She is going to be moving on to greater and greater things. I applaud all of her efforts. It's been a real pleasure. But we will be looking for a new DAG fellow over the next few weeks. So if you know any students, any young professionals who are interested in coming to join us at DAG, we will post that on our site, and we'll post that on social media, and that'll be coming around. But I wanted to thank Claire for all of her hard work and all that she's done for DAG. So I will virtually send some applause her way. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you, Eli.
So let us get into our program here. It is a real pleasure to introduce Tya Winn. Tya is trained as an architect, and she's come to the Community Design Collaborative after serving as the Director of Project Planning and Design for Habitat for Humanity. Her experience, they also include working with the Philadelphia Housing Authority and the Logan Community Development Corporation. With that, she brings a deep understanding of Philadelphia design and community development landscape and the work of the collaborative, and has a deep commitment to using design as a way to tackle social justice issues. It's a real pleasure to have her joining us today. If you have questions, we'll have a Q&A after, put them in the chat. But Tya, welcome, please take it away.
Thank you, Eli, and good morning, DAG. I am excited and thrilled to be here with all of you today. I see many names and familiar faces, but I also see some new ones, which is always exciting. My name is Tya Winn, as Eli said, and I am the Executive Director of the Community Design Collaborative. And I think we have some slides. Yep, Rodman's sharing them. All right, great. And so I'm here today to kind of introduce, reintroduce both myself and the organization. So next slide. And the Community Design Collaborative, I'm sure many of you know, it is a 501c3 organization here in Philadelphia. It was started by citizen activist architects. And it was really central to this idea of how do we strengthen neighborhoods through design. Next slide. And what is it that we do? What does that even mean, right? We provide pro bono preliminary design services to nonprofit organizations in the city. We also use professional volunteers to staff our design projects. So we create these volunteer opportunities on projects for practitioners like each of you to kind of have a way to put your ingenuity and your skills to give back in local communities. And we raise awareness about the importance of design in revitalizing communities, something that we think is really important and necessary as a solution to addressing many issues that we face kind of as a society. Next slide. And if you are familiar with us, these are just a few of the events that we have done across the year. I know some of our staff, our former executive director, Beth Miller, are here today. And so it's really thanks to kind of the work of this group over the past 30 years that we've been able to do so many really amazing transformational projects across the city, working with a variety of partners and agencies to really tackle hard-hitting issues that are affecting both the built environment and the way we live and do projects locally here in Philadelphia. Next slide. And I think it's important to kind of stop and really understand the breadth of what this means. I think we all probably are aware that Philadelphia is the largest city with the highest rate of poverty. So of the top 10 US cities, we have close to 25% poverty rate in our city. And we have one of the oldest building stocks. And so if you can imagine neighborhoods with not a lot of economic access and lots of old buildings lead to lots of very interesting issues across the city. And that's one of the spaces where we try to step in through our programs and really come in and assist and lead community to better design solutions so that they can transform the spaces and places that they live in. When we look at the past 5 years, we looked in 70% of our grants had supported economic development in neighborhoods that were experiencing what we consider economic hardship. So looking, you can see we've worked in almost every neighborhood in Philadelphia. There's not a lot of areas of Philadelphia that we haven't touched. And you can start to see the projects kind of overlaid over the economics of these communities. And we're really kind of in the trenches with the people trying to help them forward things in their communities. Next slide. And so just looking at 2020, in 2020, we were able to do 14 design grants that served 18 communities. We were able to match 120 volunteers to these projects, who provided over 5,000 pro bono hours of service, which was over $500,000 in leveraged value. And this was in 2020, right? In a year that was really difficult for all of us as we shifted because of the pandemic to working from home, working remotely. And even we had to start to think about how we work differently and what did the need mean and what did it mean to do this work kind of remotely in a way that we hadn't done it before. Next slide. But what we're really trying to get at is how do we measure this impact? Design services is really a difficult space, right? We're the precursor. We do design services so that nonprofits have the ability to go out and get funding or get broadband support or think through or address an issue or conceptualize what it is they even want to ask for. We are not the final architect. These projects then go on and have second lives when they get realized. And so trying to show the importance of the design process is not the easiest story to tell. And so when we try to tell it, the things that we focus on is the benefit to our clients. And so we know that 2 out of 3 of our design grants benefit people that are experiencing economic hardship. We know that 10 out of 15 grants over average have advanced so far of the over 800 projects that we've done in the life cycle of our organization. And we know that we've gotten 822 different people to participate in 24 task meetings. And that was in just the span of a few years. And that impact is important to us. And it's something that we use to both be a litmus test to the direction that we're headed in, but also to drive our decision making. Next slide. And so looking back, we were fortunate in the last year to work with the University of Pennsylvania on a theory of change process. We were in a cohort where we were really forced to ask some hard questions about the organization and how we operated. And we were trying to get at, how do we measure the importance of the work that we do and what does it mean to our clients? And so through surveys, we were able to ascertain that our services allowed more nonprofits to understand the design process. What we found is that a survey of our clients before they started our process, 52% felt knowledgeable and 91% felt knowledgeable at the end. So we know we've built a capacity there and enabled them to feel better about embarking on a design process, or then take that applied knowledge and use it on other projects and in other spaces of their organization. Next slide. But also, really importantly, right, because we're all in the built environment, we know getting buildings built and getting projects realized costs money, and money is hard to come by. The most nonprofits felt successful at fundraising. What we found was 19% felt it before and 48% felt it after. Obviously, this is a space where we would love to do better, and we are starting to now envision new ways that we might be able to increase that percentage over time. Next slide. But what we are really happy to know is that 4 out of our 5 nonprofits have been able to advance following a design grant. And so in 800 projects, that's pretty good odds. That means that 80% of our clients are able to take some step forward with the project as a result of having worked with us. And that's more design projects, that's more community interest and community development that we're able to sort of influence our fire start just as a result of having worked with us. Next slide. And so what do we do? Well, we all know design services can mean many things, and it takes on many forms. So I'm just going to show you a representative sample of a few of our projects that we completed last year. But the first is conceptual design that we did for Mount Vernon CDC. This one was important because it is in Mantua, which we all know is a rapidly shifting neighborhood due to a lot of other market pressures that are happening in that West Philadelphia community. And this project was an infill project. So it was taking an existing row house that the CDC hoped to acquire and convert it into a unit of affordable housing, as well as do an infill site that would allow them to expand and move their office and provide more community spaces for the organization to continue to serve the neighborhood and do their work, while fitting into the context of the community, allowing them to kind of stay connected to their constituent group. Next slide. But we also do big things, right? This is for the Parkside Association. This was a new sports facility. This is a big undertaking. This was a big vision. It was a bold vision for a very large community space. And so in this one, they were, impacting a much larger group of people, but also had the potential to really catalyze both the outdoor space and the community in this neighborhood around a need that had been identified by the residents. Next slide. But then we also work on the smaller things. This is an example of a project that we do through a partnership with the Commerce Department through the Storefront Improvement Project, where we're dealing with the very small facade improvements or upgrades that individual small business owners can come to Commerce Department and seek funds. It's a matching grant, it's up to $50,000. And so, trying to really allow them to both change their identity, improve the design, but understand the small scale of the budget and the implementation, but also understanding that small scale can still be big impact. Next slide. And then this is a picture from our schoolyards competition a few years ago, but also understanding that when we talk about the built environment, most people often default to buildings. We think of housing, we think of institutions and public infrastructure, but there's also outdoor spaces, and outdoor spaces are also very important in the way that we live our lives and in the way that we interact with one another and build community cohesion. And so also understanding that the outdoor spaces are sometimes equally in need of a purposeful design as our interior spaces. And so we've worked with many organizations as well on outdoor spaces for schoolyards, for gardens and neighborhood gardens and plazas and parks, and understanding that that is also something that's needed in many of our communities. Next slide. And so kind of boiling it down, what is it that we do? Well, one, we provide pro bono preliminary design. We do this through a series of programs. We have our core grant program. We also do technical assistance. These allow us to work with the community partner. In most instances, this is a community development corporation or other community-based developer or nonprofit working in these communities. It allows us to engage community stakeholders through the process. We bring them into the design process. They have reviews. They're able to have a voice, an agency, and a seat at the table. So they are an active part of the decision-making around what gets designed for their community. Next slide. And this is important. This community engagement is really a hallmark of our process. We think it's really important to open the doors, to widen the table, and to bring more people involved in the process, top to bottom. This is as important as the neighbor next door, or the child that goes to school in the neighborhood and just wants to understand what's happening. And it's as important as your local elected officials. Everybody kind of has a role that they play in moving a project forward, and making sure that everybody that has a role and has a say and is impacted by the decisions that we make as designers gets a moment to, one, both voice their opinion, to be brought behind the curtain to better understand the implications of what is being proposed. And also to provide their insight. We think that the community insight is the most important tool that we use as designers, and making sure that we respect that lived experience, but also incorporate it into whatever we propose and put forth for them to move forward. Next slide. And then there's a volunteer engagement. This is also a key important fact. This is obviously an organization that was started by design volunteers. And so it is always going to kind of use design volunteers. And for us, this is really important because it's an exchange. It's an exchange of knowledge. It's an exchange of skill. And it allows the designers to come in and sort of use their expertise to help facilitate moving community visions forward. It also allows designers to kind of stretch their skills. For some folks, these are projects they don't get to work on a day-to-day basis, whether they are in a certain practice type or they're at a firm that only specializes in one certain thing. It's important for designers because we really believe in peer-to-peer learning. We know that when we architecture and the built environment is a team sport. I tell people this all the time, right? It takes many different disciplines and many different expertises to create a building. It's not one person's responsibility. And so by bringing together different volunteers from these different disciplines and focus points, we're able to really leverage the best of each of our knowledge bases. And that is where great design is able to occur. And we're able to do that and mobilize it on community-based projects that is moving something forward for others, which is also just a really great feeling. Next slide. And why are we doing it? Well, we're doing it because we really believe in equitable development. We've all seen the city's changed a lot in like just the last 10 years. I think of the time that I've spent in Philly, which is just over 10 years. And we still have some work to do. We've seen inequities in our neighborhood. And I think throughout the last year, a lot of the effects of both the racial unrest of 2020 and the pandemic have showed us that there's deep inequities that are kind of systemic in our society. And it manifests itself in the physical attributes of our city. And so what responsibility do we have and what power do we have to promote the idea of equity and bring it to fruition. Next slide. And then lastly, we do public programming. This is important because it opens the doors. It allows the public in, it allows us to build partnerships, to educate, and to work with others around how we can do things better. And we know we're stronger together. And so it's important for us to both engage the public as well as learn from them as well. And so here we are, the Community Design Collaborative. I've kind of reintroduced it to all of you that know it. For those of you that don't, that is the organization in a nutshell. And then next slide, I came in. I started the collaborative in October 2020 with a real focus to kind of address many of the things that I've both experienced and witnessed in the past year, but as well as across my career. I think in Philadelphia, racial equity needs to be a priority in our city if we're going to see any real change. And I am trying now to figure out all the ways that we can start to embed this across the design process. What does it mean when design is anti-racist, right? What does it mean when design can find a way to center people and really make equity an outcome that is necessary as a part of our process? I don't know that I have the answer yet, but I'm hoping that working with this organization and great partners like DAG, we'll be able to figure out a solution that allows us to kind of keep doing what we do, but maybe shift our priorities. Next slide. And so what did that mean? I came in, it's been what, 4 months, I think, this week. And so obviously I haven't changed everything yet, but I realized, you know, using the African principle of Sankofa, right? You've got to go back to move forward. And so it was really important to me to understand both the philosophy behind how the collaborative was started, the philosophy behind kind of equity and impact and social impact in design, and what does it mean? And so today we're going to kind of jump back a little bit to move forward. Next slide. So we're going to jump back to 1961. A few of you may remember it. A few of you may be like, where is she going with this? So we'll just bear with me for a second. I'm going to start in 1961 because I think the 60s are really the framework for all of this work that I think the collaborative, but also DAG, right? I think the spirit of both of our organizations are really rooted in a lot of the movement work of the 60s, specifically in design and with reference to how people and citizens and communities engage the built environment. Next slide. We're going to start with Jane Jacobs. Everybody knows Jane. In 1961, she wrote a little book that I think forever has changed the course of how people think about cities, but also how we as designers frame how we approach and think through projects. And this was The Death and Life of the Great American City. And a really great quote that came out of that book is that cities have the capability of providing something for everybody only because and only when they are created by everybody. This really sparked the beginning of this idea of collective activism and collective action, and the idea that everybody in a city was important, everybody played a role, but mostly that everybody deserved and had a voice that needed to be heard and recognized when we were building the city. Next slide. And when I think of Jane, I really think of this idea of anything that's created for me that does not include me is not for me. And I think that's an important idea. So in 1963, what we really saw was kind of the birth of what was the first community or neighborhood design center. Next slide. And that organization was ARCH, or the Architects Renewal Community of Harlem. It was started by Max Bond. He was an architect in New York City. It was started by architects, again, volunteering their time to help solve and address issues that they saw in their community. They were doing community-based projects and visioning. They were mobilizing and organizing with residents around specific projects and developments that were happening in their neighborhood. And they were really trying to both bring their expertise and knowledge, but as well as an agency to the individuals in that community around what was happening to them in their built environment. And Arch is still one of the many, baselines for me in my kind of career and in my life. I think Max Bond has had a profound influence. And I think this is a story that isn't often told. Next slide. Then we get to 1967. And in 1967, a lot of things were happening really importantly politically, but a new funding source had sort of been opened up in the space of economic development with respect to neighborhood community investments. And next slide. And what this resulted in was the creation of the first Community Development Corporation, which was called the Bedford-Stuyvesant Restoration Corporation. It is still in practice. It is now just called Restoration. And this CDC was started by Robert Kennedy, the brother of JFK, after he had spent time as Attorney General. And he was on the ground. He was a senator. He was senator for New York, trying to figure out what his kind of next career move would be. And just a few quotes that came from various speeches across and interactions that he had in the few months kind of leading up to him initiating the CDC was him saying that he wanted to do something, right? He was telling his staffers that he wanted to have some sort of project that addressed the problems that he saw and the inequities he saw driving through the neighborhood, and listening to town hall meetings and kind of responding to the frustration and angers of his constituents. One of his constituents, a Black man in that Brooklyn neighborhood, said he was tired. He was tired of being planned for. He was tired of being promised things that weren't happening, and that he was angry because he felt like no one was helping, no one was stepping in, and there was nothing to be done. And so, at first, similar to most politicians, Robert Kennedy bristled. And he said, this isn't my problem. Like, I didn't do this. I haven't lived here. I didn't do this to you. But then he stepped back and he paused and he really thought, maybe this is something I can change. And maybe this is something where somebody ought to step up and do something. And that was the birth of CDCs as we know it. And CDCs to this day still retain their place-based nonprofit missions around bringing about change in a very specific boundary that forwards the needs and the quality of life of the citizens of that space. And they're really important, especially in our Philadelphia context. Next slide. And then the big year, 1968. I'm sure many things happened in 1968. There was, a war that was ending. There was an outcry against that. Some major figures died. That was a big year. But when we think of 1968 in the built environment, I think you guys all know where I'm going with this. We think of, next slide, Whitney Young's speech to the AIA in Seattle that fall, right? And he came and he called us out. He called us out for all sorts of reasons. It's a speech that probably is burned into many people's brains. And the quote there are many great quotes in that speech. I actually refer back to it a lot in my work. But the line that has always stuck out and has kind of stood the test of time is him saying that you are most distinguished by your thunderous silence and your complete irrelevance. And this is what the civil rights leader was saying to the profession. He was saying that because we refused to engage in social matters, because we refused to be political, we weren't even going to be important anymore. And I think this served as a really major call to action for practitioners in the field. It really, really changed how many architects started to think about their work, about how they do their work, about what impact they have, and about the agency and control that architects might have in making a difference. Next slide. And so in Philadelphia, through the American Institute of Architects, an organization was started called the Architects Workshop. And the Architects Workshop was actually one of the first community design centers. Obviously, we had Arch in Harlem, but a flurry of them started in 1968, one of which was the Architects Workshop. And looking at this map of the Architects Workshop, you can see that even in 1968, which was over 50 years ago, they were working in many of the exact same neighborhoods that the collaborative is working in today. I could superimpose these maps and those dots would almost line up directly. And so what this told me was that in 50 years, we haven't solved the problem. We're still working on it. And when I look at these pictures from the Architects Workshop, which there's not a lot of information on it, right? It's hard to see it, it's hard to know it. Most of what I know about the Architects Workshop, I have heard from individuals that have engaged it directly over time, is that apart from them being a little pixelated in black and white, a lot of these photos look very similar to the way that we're working today. Lots of pictures of architects sitting around conference tables with pens and paper, talking to community members about projects in their neighborhoods. Next slide. And what did it do? Well, one, it kind of changed the way the field operates. Not wholly, right? We know our large firms still mostly operate the same. Our large professional and collateral organizations still largely act the same. But what it did do was birth a bunch of organizations that were focused on alternate drivers to the built environment. And so looking at this slide, we see a few of the earliest community design centers. There's the Neighborhood Design Center in Baltimore, but we also same year had the Architects Workshop here in Philly. So we very much were at the beginning of this story locally, but it's birthed a bunch of other organizations. There's the Association of Community Design or Development. There's the Public Interest Design 100, right? There's Design Corp with Brian Bell. There's Rural Studio. There's Design Futures, and that's actually the poster for this year's Design Futures, which is a student conference that starts to look at socially just architecture. But this was not the norm, right? We're still not teaching this way of thinking in school. This is still not a requirement to be licensed in any of the design professions. Sensitivity to kind of these ideas, but the organizations are out there, the activists are out there, the people are out there, and they've got a body of work that's now over 50 years old to refer to and to call upon. Next slide. And what does that mean? Well, we're sitting here in 2021, and for a youngster, so if you are still in school or you're a recent graduate, what you have, which many did not before have, are models to look to. We have nonprofit architecture firms. We have socially active architecture firms now. This is just a few of the organizations. We have design collectives that are working really hard to change the way we practice, to question and challenge practitioners in the field to do things differently than they have in the past. We have books, right? These are just a few of the reading examples that show case studies and show models for how this work has been an impact and how it has been successful to go to. Next slide. And so then we jump to 1991. 1991, we were really lucky because here in Philadelphia, after the demise of the Architects Workshop, next slide, a bunch of citizen activists came together and started what we now call the Community Design Collaborative. This is just a picture of a few of our founders. And the collaborative was really important at that time because it was kind of coming in at a period in Philadelphia in the 90s where neighborhood transformation and urban renewal effects were really prominent in both our public policy and in our local practices of all of our kind of major built environment agencies at the city scale. And neighborhoods were kind of reeling and trying to figure out how do they respond, how they deal, how do they move projects forward without really intently understanding some of the mechanics and the technicalities of the kind of overlays that were placed up on them. So the organization came in as a tool, right? It was a tool for communities to access in order to try to learn more and to do different things in their communities. Next slide. And then in 2011, at our 20th year anniversary, we were really able to pause and stop and look back and say, well, we've been doing this work for 20 years, and it's really important. We know it's important because our clients have told us important. We think it's important because we're designers and we like to see projects come to fruition. We think it's important because our clients have had some success in getting these projects realized. Next slide. And we were really able to tell our story through the Leverage book that started to catalog and quantify some of the successes and outcomes of the projects that we'd already completed at that time. And to this day, there's not a lot of books that catalog this, right? I showed you a few on the next page, but I looked on Amazon 2 days ago. I own most of them, but there's probably less than 20, 25 books on these subjects. And I think 10 of them are written by the same people. So it also tells you a lot of these projects are projects that are overseas or were done for free as kind of AIDS work. And it's not really yet become a broadband solution to how we do projects, everyday projects, as a norm. Next slide. And then kind of around the same time that we hit our 20th anniversary, a parallel organization, the Philadelphia Association of Community Development Corporations, also hit their 20-year anniversary. And at the same time, they were trying to show their own impact as well. And what was really interesting is, right, you've got the organization of the activist designers that are trying to move projects forward. And then you have the organization that's sort of it's the club for all the CDCs, right? They're trying to move policy, they're trying to advocate, they're trying to lobby, but they're also trying to serve as a collective for the CDCs, trying to measure what was their impact. Because people are not paying attention to these projects and they're not measuring them in the same way that they would measure the investment that we get from for-profit projects. And what PACDC discovered was that in 2012, they had a $3.3 billion impact in Philadelphia. That was the number they measured. What did that mean for them at the time? Well, it meant that from the projects that their CDCs were completing, from the homes, both new and rehabbed, from the improvements that had been made to commercial cores, from new businesses that had come in and were operating through support of business creation, through the improvements and new community facilities, $3.9 billion had been made in Philadelphia in direct expenditures in these low and moderate income neighborhoods. And they had created $1.5 billion in value, right? Showing this collective power. And in 2020, so not even 10 years later, they did another update, and we're now at 5.4, which shows you that this industry is growing, and it's only getting better with time, and it's only making more impact with time. So one, it's important. Organizations like the Collaborative and the PACDC and DAG are important. We're making a mark, we're showing an impact, and it's something that's incredibly important in this neighborhood and in these communities and in our city, based on the population that we have. And we know that there's still work to be done. Next slide. So we jumped to 2021. Here I sit today as the new executive director of this really esteemed legacy organization. And I'm trying to figure out what is next. What does this mean? I've inherited a great history, but what comes next? Next slide. And so the staff was really able to work over the last year on this theory of change logic model. And so I walked in and they were finalizing up this logic model, and it was the greatest roadmap I could have been given walking in the door as a new ED. Because what they had been doing was spending a year asking themselves, what do we do and why are we important? Where is our relevance, right? To get back to what Whitney M. Young said, he said we were irrelevant, and the staff was saying, we know that's not true. How do we show our relevance? And so what they determined was that the problem in Philadelphia is that not all communities have access to critical resources necessary for driving development of their own built environment. We know this. This is that inequity that we're talking about. There is poverty, right? We've got class inequity in Philadelphia. We have geographic inequities in Philadelphia. We have environmental inequities in Philadelphia. We have racial inequities in Philadelphia. These are just 4. There's more. There's all sorts of other inequities. But how do we start to address these? Is it design's responsibility? What can we do as designers? What can we control? And what can we impact? And so what we asked ourselves and determined at the Community Design Collaborative was that all communities will have access to critical resources necessary for driving that development. That is how we put ourselves out of business. We have to provide the access to these resources. And how do we do this? Well, there's multiple ways we can do it. We can do it on the short term. We can do it kind of medium term, but then there's some things that we need to do. They're systemic, they're deep, they're going to take more time. They're going to take building trust. They might take new communities, right? We might need to find new partners. We might need to entrench ourselves in new spaces to really see an impact. And what we were really ultimately trying to get to was universal access across 3 different audiences. And to make the biggest impact, we realized we really had to be doing deeper, targeted technical assistance. Next slide. And so what does this mean? What are we doing in 2021? Well, first we're going to celebrate. It's the organization's 30th anniversary. This is my shameless plug. This is our commercial break. And so I would like to take this opportunity to invite each and every one of you to join us for Leverage, our annual fundraiser. It will be June 3rd. So save the date, put it in your calendar. If you've got your phone out right now, just, I live by Siri. I go where Siri tells me to go. So if you need Siri to tell you where to go, let her know. June 3rd, we will be convening online. But also we're going to be taking this moment to really talk about the impact and share the stories that we've had from our volunteers, from our clients, from the communities that have experienced our process and have been impacted by the work that has been done by many of your colleagues and many of you, right? Because many of you are actually also volunteers, and I thank you for that. But it's important that we tell these stories, because one thing that I realized when I was going back and doing that research is that a lot of people don't tell these stories. And then the information is hard to find, and people are able to write it off because they can't see it. Next slide. The other thing we want to do is celebrate our successes. This is just one of the many stories of many projects that have moved forward. This one is a little older. But Cyber Village, Mount Tabor Community Development and Economic Development Corporation, or SEED as it's known affectionately, was in Northern Liberties, or what we now call Northern Liberties. It was a religious congregation that was also trying to do community development. They were small. The seed of idea started that they needed affordable housing. The residents saw that the neighborhood was changing around them. They felt a little powerless. They didn't know what to do. They didn't know how they were going to be able to make an impact or change their reality. So they came to the collaborative, and the collaborative worked with them to develop a plan for an affordable housing project that also addressed some other needs in the community. And they were able to get this project built. They were able to work with a local firm to design the project. It was able to get funded through the low-income housing tax credit program. It was open. It's been open now for almost 10 years. And there's a documentary that tells their work, right? They were able to this is the life cycle of the project. This is the life cycle we want to see. And just this story took over 10 years to tell. And so it's also to remind us, this is a waiting game. We know it's average, it takes 3 to 6 years to get a development off the ground, especially when an organization is lower resourced or doesn't have as much capacity, or they're working off all volunteers who work during the day, and have families to raise. So our patience is important, but also when we get these wins, celebrating all of them is also equally as important. Next slide. We're going to keep doing our programs, right? We've got kind of two programs right now. One, the one that most people know is our core grant program. This is just some like basic understanding of what it is of this preliminary design service. It's typically a finite project that happens over the course of anywhere from 4 to 6 months with the design team around a specific project. But like I said, we realized doing this theory of change logic model that we really needed to do more technical assistance. So last year, we launched our technical assistance program. It's quiet. Most people don't seem to know about it yet, but we are doing targeted technical assistance for partners, for organizations, for people that either need a very specific help in one area. Maybe it's not a full design grant. Maybe they just need a feasibility study. Maybe they just need some advice. Maybe they just need to work through one thing. But we can come in and tailor what the needs are to that organization. We can also be on call. So we have some organizations that have kept us on call as they're trying to move through their first big project. People that just need a little more support and a little more assistance. Next slide. And we're also trying to use this to try new programming. This is the conceptual design for Electric Street. This is a street in South Philly near Passyunk Avenue. It's Percy Street, where we worked a few years ago with their civic association to try to figure out a way to do some creative placemaking and tactical urbanism in a shared alley behind their houses. They wanted to activate it. They wanted to create a destination, both for the neighbors and for the greater community and city at large. Their idea was that they were going to turn this into a place that people all over Philadelphia came to visit. And they've been working, right? In the pandemic, they have built 6 new murals back there. They've created a gateway. They've come together as a community group and had community build days to start realizing this conceptual plan. And so our hope, we actually submitted last night. So everybody cross your fingers. It's why my slides were late last night, guys. We submitted to the National Endowment of the Arts to do an activation of this space next year at Design Philadelphia. So we're hopeful we'll get the funding. But our plan is to come out and, one, celebrate the work that the community was able to do after we left them with our design grant to try to move this project forward. Next slide. And we need to respond. Last year was difficult. We know a lot of organizations and neighborhoods were really struggling with the effects of the pandemic, both real and ancillary. Some of them were just adjusting to new changes and regulations and processes, but others were really impacted by the way they were able to do business. And we jumped in to help. We realized that we kind of had to shift our focus last year. We started a program called Design Aid, which was assistance in demand, where we would do quick projects that helped businesses and nonprofits address changing and meeting the COVID regulations so that they could either get some aspect of their business back running or continue to serve their clients safely. This is one that we did for a Sunday breakfast rescue mission so that they could resume their feeding program by still meeting both the line requirements and the single entry and exit requirements that were imposed due to the pandemic. Next slide. But we also did a competition. We were thinking ahead. So very early in the pandemic, we realized that this was going to impact the way people engage things that they were used to doing every day. So we launched a competition around outdoor school yards. And what would it mean for schools to kind of shift programming outside and do outdoor classrooms? With this, we created a design guideline that is free online, so anybody can access and see the principles, the solutions that were proposed, so they can be used for inspiration anywhere. But we also worked with the school district, and so we put up $30,000 of quick implementation money so the school district can actually realize some of these, which we're hoping will get built when the weather breaks and they can return to outdoor classrooms so the students can be back in school and still be safe. but still create an environment that is child friendly and encourages learning. Next slide. But we know we need to advocate. And this is a space that we know we need to do more of. It's a space that I know I've been more interested in personally. I look forward to bringing it to the organization as a whole. And I know this is important to DAG. I know you guys will understand these next two slides very well. But what do we need to do? Well, we need to advocate for high profile opportunities in the built environment that affect us all as citizens. And we need to encourage community engagement through these projects. And these are just a few projects, some that have happened that I personally think could have had a little bit more community engagement, might have helped both their fruition, like what was brought to fruition, but also the process and the media coverage of them on the back end, but also projects that we have coming on or maybe have been sitting for some time that I think also could use some citizen activation. Next slide. But we can also advocate for new design models and the importance of the design process. Design has many different benefits, right? And one thing we know is that when we test new ideas and when we test new models, we're able to get really, really interesting results. And so, you know, I heard Andy Toy mention at the top of this, the ADU, I saw him put it in the chat, but like, we know that there's this kind of next frontier that has not quite taken hold yet in Philadelphia. Around kind of the ADU and the tiny house or missing middle housing typologies. And this is something that we've also put a proposal into PHFA around working on in the next year about what this means for Philadelphia and how we can make these appropriate solutions in our communities, in our neighborhoods on infill sites. Next slide. And then we can inform. This is something we already do, but we're trying to think of better and new ways to use both our platform and our resources. So this month, we actually, if any of you are on our newsletter, we unveiled a new format for Design Matters, which is our monthly newsletter that will be chock full of more information, but also resources, partnered events, and things that we think are just important to add to the conversation that people should be thinking about and seeing. Additionally, we launched our social media platforms in the last year. So we are now on Facebook, LinkedIn, and on Instagram. And we're trying to really find better ways to use that platform to both share information about idols and things that are inspiring us, but also tell the stories of our kind of comrades in arms in the ground across the country, but specifically also here in Philadelphia, and highlight other people that are really doing this work and being pioneers in this field and providing inspiration to us all. Next slide. And then what do we have coming? Well, we're trying to work on some equity talks. We're going to be launching very soon. If anyone is on our newsletter, and I'll put the link to sign up for our newsletter at the end of the talk, we will be launching our first equity talk next month, and we are hoping to do 4 this year, trying to look at the ways that race kind of intersects the built environment and what that means in specific communities and ethnicities. We're going to continue doing corridor realities. This is the program we do every year with the Commerce Department as part of Design Philadelphia, but understanding that corridors in the past year have dealt with a lot more than they had in previous years, and trying to figure out what does that mean for this year? What is the story we need to tell, and what is beneficial to us locally? We're going to start trying to partner with folks to do trainings. We have one that we're working on. PACDC invited us to work with the corridor managers actually that have been affected by some of the looting early next month, but we're hoping to expand this to be both more trainings for both our volunteers as well as for our clients. And then lastly, strategic planning. It's time for a new plan, new ED, new vision, new year. We're really trying to lean into strategic planning and use that process to both look at equity factors and also impact. How do we measure it? And then how do we talk about it? Next slide. And we want to partner. These are some of our really great partners. These are some of our biggest funders and supporters. And we know that we don't do this alone. We're stronger together. And we're really grateful for the partners that we have, both foundations in the city. But we know that we need new friends. And so if you go to the next slide, Also, other organizations that we're hoping to partner with across the year. This is just a sample of some of the organizations where we're either members, and we're looking to kind of expand our membership to do cross-organizational partnerships, but also places where we might have submitted proposals to do other projects with across the year. And so we're hopeful that at some point, if we were to do this presentation a year from now, that first slide will be really full and that this slide will either have new logos or be empty. Next slide. And then most importantly, we need to keep serving. Philadelphia citizens need support, right? And we know design is a solution. We all wouldn't be here if we didn't think that design had the power to change the world. So we need to keep serving. And so one thing we will be doing this year, although the AIA convention will unfortunately not be happening in person in Philadelphia and it has been moved to virtual convening, the legacy project that happens annually with AEC Cares is still happening in Philadelphia, and it will still be in person. We have partnered with one of our previous clients, Sunday Breakfast Rescue Mission. We're bringing back our team from the 2016 convention. There's a picture of them there to do another intervention at the shelter in September. So stay tuned. There'll be opportunities to volunteer later this year. Next slide. But also we got to keep serving our communities. Engagement is really important. Convening is really important. Bringing people together. That's where the magic happens for the collaborative. And we don't intend to stop doing that. We intend to double it down and to find new and better ways to continue to do it. So with that, next slide. I invite all of you to think about how you strengthen neighborhoods through design, to challenge you to continue to do it and find spaces for it in the work that you do. And if you can't find spaces for it on your own, know that we are always here as a resource, and we are always happy to have more people as a part of our organization. So I encourage you to share with your colleagues the ability to come volunteer, bring a friend, but also if you know any organizations that might be in need of services, to point them in our direction, because we would love to serve them as well. And so with that, next slide, I think I'm done. I think that's the, yep, last slide. So thank you guys, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. This was a wonderful presentation, and we got some questions, we got some comments coming in. I think just an easy one up front. Rob Cattell was just wondering of the breakdown of new construction versus reuse preservation projects that are going on within the collaborative.
So all of our projects are pre-development, right? So we have 28 active projects right now. So I actually can't tell you of the 28 that are active right now, which ones are reuse or an existing building and when are new. I'm trying to count off the top of my head while I'm thinking. Hold on. I think we probably have half are reuse, right? I'd say at least half are either an existing structure or existing site, in addition, or something that's happening in a facility that's already operational. And the other half are sort of either speculative projects. So we have a lot of things right now around the idea of playful learning landscapes, which is something that can be applied to an existing project. And some of them we haven't quite selected what project it will be ascribed to. And then some are, completely new spaces, whether it's a playground or an outdoor yard or a transformation or a garden. But I think right now we're probably at 50-50. But that shifts, it kind of shifts based on what projects are moving in the city, what funding's available, depending on the year and depending on what city program is kind of moving, you see different changes.
So Michelle Saul has a question, and please keep the questions coming. How do you influence some of the city's major universities that have contributed to more of the gentrification of some of these neighborhoods?
Yeah, I think that's a hard one. We have lots of friends at the universities, I think, both in faculty. I know we have really good connections to faculty at both UPenn and Drexel and Jefferson and Temple, right? But they're just one person in their department. I would say typically the friends of the collaborative are the ones that are trying to be the change agents in those spaces. They're typically the ones that are trying to teach the students how to do better. I also think in Philadelphia, one of the unique spaces the collaborative is in is that of the other community design centers, we're one of the few that survived, right? That's not attached to a university. And so there's the benefit of being attached to a university because there's the funding and there's the people resources, right? And there's definitely students, right, to do some of the work. So I think a lot of those, they're more visible, right? You see them winning more awards, you see more articles about them, they're highly published. But at the same time, they're also probably a little bit part of the problem, right? Because they are of the university and you've got the university doing, I call it design tourism, but like we see them in the studios and neighborhoods where they're kind of over planning. If I hear another organization say, I've made this neighborhood our studio classroom, it's like one of the things that grinds my gears, like neighborhoods are playgrounds for students. But I think it's an interesting relationship because at the same time, there's an impact that needs to be made, and the universities have some resources that other organizations don't. So I think in the past, the collaborative has done things like shared studios or hosted courses at a lot of the universities. We've done technical assistance projects where we're right now we're working very closely with researchers at Temple University around some of the playful learning landscapes and literacy application pieces. But I think that is something I would like to sort of explore more in the coming years, is like, what does that mean? And like, how can we hold universities accountable? How do you hold your friends accountable? I think that's the question, right? What power do we have? Where's that line in the sand? Because there's a line in the sand for sure. Like you cross it and it's probably problematic. But I think more space and more work does need to be done in our neighborhoods around kind of spaces that are engaged by universities, both physically like located near them, but also spaces that they kind of are working in as labs.
So as DAG, over this past year, we found moving to Zoom, making our presentations available to more people has been a really wonderful sort of benefit to this forced isolation we're all in. Have there been things in the way you interact with your team and how the CDC interacts that you're keeping from this sort of pressure situation we found ourselves under in the last year?
Yeah, I'm hoping so. I mean, I'll say we were all remote when I started. We've been all remote since I started. And I think there's two things. So one, I think it is easier to engage partners, and it's easier to engage, I'd say, for example, board members on Zoom. People can pop in the middle, in the middle of the day. They don't have to travel. We don't have to physically come to the Center for Architecture to meet, which to me, is allowed more engagement of certain groups of people. I think it's also required more agency and autonomy of staff, right? Because we're checking in, but nobody wants to be in Zoom all day. And so it also has given them a little bit more ownness over their work, right? I think they're able to kind of work a little more independently or collectively with outside partners rather than be kind of holed up around a conference room, which I'm hoping, I mean, I haven't quantified it, but just in my assumption, I think that means that we're spending more time actually doing the work. Rather than talking about the work or thinking about the work or planning about the work. And I know in design, that's a space that we can often get stuck, or you plan for the meeting to talk about the thing that you're going to do. It's like Inception. I think another thing that I'm really hopeful post the pandemic is, the Center for Architecture is great. It's a space I miss very much. I'm sure you guys miss it as well. I think it's convenient for many of us that work. It's a beautiful space. And I think for us as designers, it's kind of our home base. It's our clubhouse, right? Like we all go in, everybody has this really sense of deep familiarity. It's our collective living room. But it's not the living room for many of the clients that we work with. And the default is that we do a lot of our programming there. And so I think the other nice thing about Zoom is that community groups have been able to kind of pair it in or jump in from wherever they are. And I think a post-pandemic, I would like to see us do more about meeting them where they are. Not that we don't. I think, staff does do a great job. We do get into the communities, but there are still a lot of meetings that happen in our space. And I think as much as we can like get into communities, I think they need to both see us passively and actively doing the work.
So another hardball for you. So on the topic of gentrification in neighborhoods, does CDC see themselves as culpable in the discussion of gentrification by providing projects that become catalysts for speculative development? How does CDC try to prevent successful projects from becoming launching points for displacing longtime residents?
So, I mean, I think that's the problem with development, right? I mean, development is meant to be a catalyst. It's meant to spur and encourage other development. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think one of the hard things about gentrification, right? We've made it a very dirty term. And I don't know how many of you know, well, actually, this is DAG. You guys probably all know, like the term gentrification was first used in an article to describe our city, right? The first use of the word gentrification was describing what happened to Society Hill. So kind of like post the 1950s, like late 1950s. So I think when we hear the word gentrification, what it's really trying to measure and talk about is displacement, which I think you kind of touched on, Eli, right? But like, what are people really afraid of? They're afraid that they're going to lose their community. They're afraid they're going to lose their livelihood. This is the places these people live and work, and this is where their friendships are. These are the houses their children grew up in. This is their connection, like this is their roots. And so people are really afraid of disrupting their roots, just like plants. We don't like to be disrupted. And so, and we don't like our roots not having room to grow, right? Like nobody wants to feel boxed in by something that's foreign. And so I think because our process is really focused on the community group, right? They are the designers and they are the leaders and the agents of our process. We're trying to empower them to do the project that's important to them before the outside developer can come in and do something different. In terms of how do we fight the displacement, we do it in a myriad of ways. I think the best way is by including the community voices. We require sort of a community team that's put together at the beginning of the project. It's put together with representatives that stakeholders that are identified by both the organization, but also by our volunteer team and staff of the collaborative. So it's to make sure that it is like truly comprehensive and inclusive of all the voices that need to be represented in the design process. So what I would hope is that because our process is pre-development services, that more people are now alerted and understanding and well-versed and educated in what the impact of the project could be because they've took part in the process and they've been able to hear the design team talk through some of the potential outcomes, but also that they're going to now sustain being a part of that process as the project moves. Because we all know conceptual design is really like what, step zero, right? There's so many steps that would take to get a project from when we finish with it as a conceptual design. I mean, they've literally got to take a rendering and bring it to life. And we all know like that's just a much harder process than any one of us can really depict in words. And so I'm hoping by getting them involved and kind of having them on the ground early, one that gives them both a power, but it also gets them ahead of some of the other factors that might affect them. But I mean, there's definitely outside investment. There's not a lot we can do about the ancillary investments that pop up. I think the best we can do is educate, right? And I think the more education and the more resources that we can provide the communities to both understand the greater picture of what's happening as well as like their little specific project. And I mean, I think there's a lot of entities in Philadelphia that are already doing a lot of that work. I think it's amplifying the voices. I saw Donna Carney was on here early. I think it's the Citizens Planning Institute, right, is crucial in that space. I think PACDC is crucial in that space. I see John Cromer, he's been working in that space through FELS for years. And I think it's like both amplifying the work that people are already doing, because a lot of experts have been working on this for years. This is not a new problem, and there are people that have been working on solutions, but also making sure that we kind of provide new resources, or even provide resources that already exist, and point our clients to the things that will help them do better.
I got one more, and from David Brownlee. Douglas, thank you for your question. David asks, are you able to address larger, i.e. citywide or regional issues? Seems like the small scale, granular projects offer opportunities to demonstrate success, and how do we grow that? There are plenty of there's conversation above in the chat about, celebration is good. It's important. It gives everyone an understanding of all of the good things that are happening, and it, balances some of the negative news narratives, and focuses on this good work. So how do you grow that? How do you bring that up to the larger scale?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think through the infill initiatives, which we've been doing for the past 10 years, every other year, that's part of what infill was designed to do, tackle big issues. We've covered affordable housing, we've covered stormwater management, we covered school buildings that were kind of not in productive use. But I think we would love to move this to a city scale. We have been talking to various city partners. We've been reaching out and trying to talk to the Planning Commission. I think there's much larger civic issues that we could talk about. I think there's pilots, right? I think there are instances of projects that mean something very specifically to one neighborhood, but represent opportunities that could be applicable everywhere. I think of things like the Rebuild Initiative, and like that's essentially what Rebuild did. It took a super micro localized thing, this one rec center, library, or park, but said, this is the issue across the city, and how do we both create a sustainable funding source, but process to kind of revitalize this building typology, or this project typology. I think there's lots of instances for things like that in Philadelphia. I think we also have a lot of systems that aren't quite working yet. I think there's things that on the ground we all hope would work, or we all want to work, and need a little bit more attention or thought into them. I think of things like the land bank, or processes like community land trusts. We're not going to run out of projects tomorrow. I mean, I think all of us are probably hoping we could put ourselves out of business. Maybe not you that own architecture firms. You guys might not be trying to put yourselves out of business. But, I think as long as people live in buildings, we're going to have things to do. So I think as long as we can kind of stay nimble and adapt to the change in times and the needs of people, we'll always be relevant, to kind of get back to that challenge from Whitney M. Young. That's our relevance, right? I said, the other day I was on a conversation with someone else, and I was saying, everything we do as people, like anything that we touch, was either designed or not designed on purpose. Which is like a really interesting idea of the things that were not designed on purpose. One that's generally a scar in our neighborhood. If things were like intentionally not designed and they were just kind of left over, it's generally an act of what I call spatial violence, because it was done on purpose. But everything in our space that we encounter, whether it's the surface and the sidewalk that we walk on to the like very specific room we're all sitting in right now, it was designed by somebody. And I think part of the problem with our field is that, nobody demystifies design. It becomes this like secret magic skill that we all have. Like we're like wizards and like, oh, design. People really think they cannot understand or behold the design process. And while, yes, it takes, I think, a lot of thought, technical skill, and creativity to deploy it, that doesn't make it not understandable by others. I think the more that we can allow others to understand what it is we do and how we do it, and it will increase the importance of it to others, because it's important to us. We all know, right? The famed architect's ego, it's really important to us, but like other people don't hold it as quite a significance. But we know that because it's reflected in how we get paid. It's reflected in how we get talked about. It's reflected in how we get acknowledged or how we don't get acknowledged when projects get done. Oftentimes the last person that the general public talks about is the architect. And so I think through that celebration, we've got to also highlight the work and the workers that do it.
Well, I wanted to thank you for your time. We put all the links are in the chat. Go subscribe. You want to drop another leverage plug on us?
Sure. Leverage is June 3rd. We will be dropping tickets soon. And if anyone or any organizations are interested in sponsoring, the sponsor package should be out next week.
And then DAG plugs, Thursday, March 11th. We'll be back here to talk about The Painted Bride. That's at 10 o'clock. The recording, we will be wrapping this up. Our goal is to get this up by the end of the week. So hopefully by Friday, this will be on our website under the events tab, and you can share the link with folks. Tya, thank you so much. Let's do our virtual applause that we often do here. Thank you, and everyone have a great day.